T was another electric Saturday night at Rockefeller Center, the home of Saturday Night Live. The audience buzzed with anticipation, studio lights gleamed across the polished stage, and the familiar jingle of "Weekend Update" faded into applause. Pete Davidson adjusted his tie, not because he liked wearing one, but because it felt like a costume he had to wear to play normal. The red light blinked on, the teleprompter rolled, and just like that, it was showtime. "Good evening, I'm Pete Davidson," he said with his signature smirk. "And this is Weekend Update, where the news is fake but the anxiety is real." The crowd burst into laughter. It was the kind of line only Pete could deliver, half joke, half confession. Behind the cameras, the producers held their breath. Pete was known for going off script, but that's what made him magnetic. He could turn a dull headline into a roller coaster of emotion, comedy, and honesty. Tonight, he was in rare form. He talked about politics. Congress is fighting again. Shocker. It's like watching divorced parents argue over who gets the Wi-Fi password. He talked about pop culture. Taylor Swift's new album is so emotional, my therapist asked me for a session after listening. And then, as always, he slipped in something deeply personal. My mom says I should date someone normal. But what's normal? Someone who doesn't Google themselves every night. The crowd roared. Pete grinned but his eyes flickered, that mix of humor and hurt he carried so naturally. His jokes weren't just jokes, they were pieces of truth, carefully disguised in sarcasm. It was what made him different from every other comic who'd sat in that chair. Colin Yost, his company anchor, tried to keep the show on track, shuffling papers and giving Pete his signature side eye. "Pete, are you saying you're not normal?" Pete smirked. "Bro, I'm on live TV talking about my mental health, what do you think?" The laughter shook the studio again. Even the camera crew cracked smiles behind the lenses. Pete was unpredictable, but that was the point. Weekend Update wasn't just about fake news anymore, it was therapy disguised as sketch comedy. As the final cue card flashed, Pete wrapped up with his usual dry flair. "That's the news, or at least what's left of it. I'm Pete Davidson. Go call your mom, she probably misses you." Applause thundered through Studio 8H. Pete waved to the audience, his grin wide and easy, the lights reflecting in his eyes. But behind that glow, there was something deeper, a man using humor to stay afloat in a world that often felt too heavy. When the red light finally went dark, Pete exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "We did it," he muttered. Another night, another laugh, another piece of himself left on the stage. In that moment, as the laughter faded, Pete wasn't just a comedian, he was real news in a fake news world. His applause still echoed faintly in the hallway as Pete Davidson walked backstage, the glow of the studio lights fading behind him. His laughter-filled segment on Weekend Update had just ended, but the energy that filled Studio 8H moments ago now dissolved into a quiet hum of after-show chaos. Crew members unplugging cables, writers congratulating each other, and the faint hiss of coffee machines brewing one last round for the night. Pete slipped past it all, hoodie already up, his tie long gone. He wasn't one for the after parties or the press photos. For most people, that 10-minute desk segment was comedy. For Pete, it was therapy with a live audience. His phone buzzed non-stop. Mentions, memes, retweets, the digital applause of the modern world. One headline already read, "Pete Davidson's brutal honesty wins the night." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Brutal honesty," he whispered. "Funny how people love it until it's about them." He stepped outside the NBC building, greeted by the crisp Manhattan air. The city felt alive, taxis honking, neon lights flickering, a few fans calling his name from across the street. "Pete, selfie," someone shouted. He smiled and waved but kept walking. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew once he stopped, the wall between Pete the comedian and Pete the human would crumble. He found his favorite late-night pizza spot a few blocks away, a tiny place that smelled like melted cheese and nostalgia. The owner, Sal, nodded. "The usual." "Yeah," Pete replied, sliding into a booth. "Extra napkins, man. It's been one of those nights." As he waited, he pulled out his notebook, scribbles of jokes, thoughts, and half-finished poems. Between punchlines about dating apps and therapy bills, there were raw lines that never made it to SNL. Laughter hides what silence screams. He stared at it for a long moment. That line wasn't for TV. It was for him. Sal placed the slice in front of him. "You were funny tonight," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. Pete smiled faintly. "Yeah, you think so?" Sal shrugged. "You made people laugh. That counts for something." Pete nodded. Maybe that was enough, for tonight. By the time he left the pizzeria, the streets were quieter. The city that never slept had slowed just enough to breathe. Pete walked along 6th Avenue, hands buried in his pockets, the chill biting through his hoodie. He thought about how strange fame was, how people saw him as fearless just because he could joke about pain. But the truth was simpler: humor was armor. It didn't erase the hurt, it just made it bearable. He stopped by the riverfront, the city skyline reflecting in the dark water. "Funny guy, serious world," he murmured, repeating the words like a prayer. Somewhere in that quiet, he found peace, not in the laughter, but in the silence that followed it. Tomorrow, the cameras would roll again. But tonight, Pete Davidson was just another New Yorker, tired, human, and beautifully imperfect.